Mary Michael Corbett, who recently retired as Executive Director of Baptist Health Foundation. She's a leading member of the Speakers Committee and a Paul Harris Fellow, a former director, and just so delighted she will be introducing today's guest speaker, Mary Michael.
Thank you, Julie, and good afternoon, Rotarians. It's great to be with you today. In addition to being a Mercy Girl, Peggy Noe Stevens is an author, a brand expert, a bourbon aficionado, and the first female master bourbon taster in the world. She's the founder of the Bourbon Women's Association and worked with the Kentucky Distillers Association to establish the Bourbon Trail. Basically, whenever tourism and bourbon are involved, Peggy's in the middle of it. She works with distilleries throughout the country to help them build one-of-a-kind visitor experiences and works with non-spirits corporations to help them with branding and strategy. Peggy is the author of 3 books. Her newest, published just this year, is entitled, "Which Fork Do I Use with My Bourbon?" It's a step-by-step guide to a successful bourbon tasting party. Her previous books include Professional Presence, a guide to building your personal brand, and The Culinary Cocktail Tour, a journey with bourbon. She is a contributing food and spirits writer for American Whiskey Magazine and entertaining editor for Bourbon Plus magazine. She also serves as a spirits judge for the American Distilling Institute and is on the faculty of Moonshine University, which in and of itself sounds fun. Excuse me, allergies. Please join me in welcoming Peggy Noe Stevens to Rotary.
Thank you, Mary Michael. Congratulations on your retirement.
Thank you.
And hello, Rotarians. I can't tell you how excited I was when I was asked to talk about my favorite topic, bourbonomics. And my only regret on this very beautiful Kentucky day is that I don't have a glass of bourbon in my hand to drink with you, alongside of you, but we're gonna kind of do the next best thing. So I am going to share my screen, if you don't mind, and we will get this bourbon journey started. All right, hopefully my screen is up and ready. And I have to tell you, I feel very fortunate in the industry because I have been able to be kind of sitting on the sidelines for the last 30 years, watching this incredible evolution of bourbon and how it's affected our economy. But I have to tell you that it has not always been this great journey that we're on with our bourbonism right now. In fact, when I started in the industry, if you can imagine that Kentucky tourism on the state level, bourbon did not even meet or make the top 10 things to do in Kentucky for tourism. I know that's unbelievable how much we talk about bourbon now, how many distilleries have blossomed over the years, but there's something that we did know back then. We knew that Kentucky was the home to at least 95% of the world's bourbon. And I got to tell you, that has not changed. That statistic is still intact. After all of these years, we still make 95% of the world's bourbon. But what we didn't do, and that's why I'm going to take you a little bit on a journey, is we didn't market ourselves correctly. 30 years ago, we didn't shout from the rooftops why this is so important to our culture. And back in that day, when we didn't make the top 10, believe it or not, the Kentucky Bourbon Trail didn't even really get rolling till the 1990s. I was fortunate to be one of the founders of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, but this is all of the distilleries that was on the first brochure. This was literally the first brochure that kicked off the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. But where we found the best success is when we turned it around and decided to market it globally. That it was one of the most important things we could do for our industry was to spread the good word and also kind of premiumize ourselves. So we became more than marketers. We developed a culture that surrounded bourbon. And what we tried to do was make everybody an expert. Yes, I am a master taster and a Mercy graduate, as you heard. But what we try to do is say, hey, you can enjoy bourbon as much as we do. Let us share with you our techniques, our traditions, our heritage, our culture, and have you come along on the bourbon journey. Now, also, I have to say, and that's that bottom right-hand corner, social media took off. Podcasts on whiskey, conferences that we hosted to teach and educate the consumer and give a voice to the platform for the consumer to hear. You know, those were probably some of the key things, but I'm also going to share some other trends. Now, living like a locavore in tourism. You know, everybody wants to live like someone from Kentucky. You know, what is our culture? What is our heritage? And we invited that consumer into our culture. You know, and also I have to say that we finally put the consumer in the driver's seat. You know, it became not enough just to take them on a production tour. They wanted to get in the cornfields. They wanted to understand how to make a barrel and what white oak means to our industry. So what we did was try to create more interaction and interactive ways that they can engage during our tourism tours. Another trend was really applauding the entrepreneurial craft movement. And I have to say personally, that was a catalyst for me to start my company, because 13 years ago when I started Peggy Noe Stevens and Associates, I saw a craft movement, you know, smaller, whether it be mom and pop family distilleries or whether it would be investors coming to Kentucky to start a new brand and almost have kind of what I call the whiskey playground, you know, because Kentucky is so famed for making great whiskey. So now I believe we have 63 distilleries on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, which is outstanding. But most of those are craft distillers, you know, experimenting, wanting to create new versions of bourbon, new versions of rye, moonshine, and all types of spirits. And the industry, I'm happy to say, is supporting them. Now, of course, my company goes beyond the borders of Kentucky. You know, so other regions are making bourbon like Texas, New York, Ohio. But again, to hold on to that infrastructure right here in our backyard, you know, this has been the most successful for the bourbon industry and what we produce. I will say though, it's a camaraderie, it's a community. And I mentioned Moonshine University in my resume because we are the catalyst and the global instigators for bringing people right here to Louisville and teaching them how to make fine spirits. I will also say one of the bigger successes, which is truly making a difference in our industry, is transparency with archaic legislation. You know, we still just passed a bill this past spring that allows us to start shipping to at least 7 states outside of Kentucky. Now, I know that might not seem like a big deal, 7 states, but it is forever since we have been able to be like the wine industry in Napa Valley and ship wine all over the world. You know, we still do not have that luxury here in Kentucky. So new tax reform through the Kentucky Distillers Association is so key to our future growth, but we're making headway. And I think too, because of COVID and isolation and restaurant shutdowns, et cetera, it has loosened some of the bills and some of the legislations that we've been kind of handcuffed. So for example, cocktails to go. That is a key one that has happened over the shutdown that you've seen. Now, whether that law will stay when everything truly reopens to full capacity, we don't know. But this is a very key insight. Shipping beyond the borders of Kentucky is very important to our industry. Also, another success was the investments that the distilleries have been making and continue to make. Investments to the infrastructure, you know, tourist destinations like Woodford Reserve Distillery, where I was the visitor center director back in the 1990s. You know, that was a bit of a catalyst in other distilleries wanting to invest. And as the consumer again grows more in their curiosity of bourbon and experiences, you know, the industry is listening. I think recently in Business First, Angel's Envy just announced a bit of an expansion, which was very exciting. And I know Heaven Hill is doing the same. So you're going to see more and more of these larger spirits companies continuing to evolve their brand destinations alongside the growth of whiskey. This is one that you may not be aware of that truly helped our industry as well as a trend. It was pop culture. You know, if you remember that movie Mad Men, and it really created kind of a bourbon halo of premium and masculine spirits. So cocktails, for example, like the Manhattan, like the Old Fashioned that came from that show. And people would watch it and said, gosh, I've never heard of that cocktail. What is it made with? And of course, the answer was bourbon. So retro cocktails became vogue. And even our city today, I believe the Old Fashioned is our signature cocktail of the city. And so as mixology grows, we grow. And the more curious that a consumer becomes in being kind of their own home bar mixologist, the more our sales create. Another trend that I wanted to share today is consumers are more knowledgeable, actually, than ever before about the products they sip due to what I was speaking about before. Social media, podcasts, the internet, you know, they're doing really deep research. And it might surprise you how knowledgeable they are when they know the actual recipe bill of each whiskey brand that they're drinking, or they've toured the warehouses and know a particular section of someone's warehouse where they like their single barrel whiskey. I mean, they are taking a deep dive to be educated, and we kind of have to keep up with them. Another trend is the more premium, the faster it sells. The more exclusive, the more they want it. The more limited in expressions that you see, a lot of these limited expressions that are coming out, you're going to see more and more of those, not only from the craft distillery segment, but also the larger spirits company, because it creates a lot of fever, as I say, in the bourbon industry for consumers to want that product. And there is a huge demand for premium American spirits right now, all across the board. The other half of the population is also speaking quite loud. I am the founder of the Bourbon Women Association, and when we started that organization almost 10 years ago, it was almost unheard of for the industry to market to women specifically, because as I showed you on a previous slide, you know, there was a lot of masculinity that surrounded drinking whiskey. Well, the bourbon women industry has changed that. We have found that women actually are incredibly loyal to the bourbon industry, and they actually like their whiskey spicier, more robust, and higher proof, which really debunks the myth in the industry that women like softer, fruitier, lighter spirits. And so avid marketing is happening in the industry to reach that other half of the population, and it's working quite well. The culinary scene. Louisville has a beautiful culinary scene, and restaurants, and they're probably some of your favorite restaurants that you know, have jumped on this bandwagon. You know, I think of Bourbon Bistro as one of them that actually has started their own product that they sell out of their restaurant, which is quite fascinating as a trend. But this is happening across the nation, and it's also happening to be incorporated bourbon into menus, into food pairings, into tasting flights. So you're going to see more and more culinary offerings which help the sale of our fine spirits. So the proof is in the pudding. This is from the Kentucky Distillers Association, and just the very few trends and direction that I had mentioned. You know, in the last 2 years, bourbon increased by $1 billion and over 2,000 distillery-related jobs to its workforce. That's an incredible number. They've poured $8.5 billion back into the state economy, and they provided some $825 million in taxes. So I think that bourbon, when you really think of the economics of it, it's doing its job. Now, where are we today? You know, with the shutdown, where are we today with the industry direction? You know, despite our tremendous success financially, visitors, as of today, still make up more than 1 million stops on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. Right now on the Bourbon Trail, there's 23 participating distilleries, and in the last 10 years, over 314% growth. But of course, we had a couple of detours, you know, with the shutdown, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But something that I think you'll see as well, you know, today and current and present, is that our craft distilleries who have become very successful, like Copper and King, for example, are starting to see acquisitions. They're starting to see major investments from outside spirits companies. For example, Constellation Brands, an outside spirits company, is buying shares and investments and percentages in different craft brands, you know, eventually to acquire. Rabbit Hole is another example. Pernod Ricard came in. Angel's Envy is another example, with Bacardi purchasing Angel's Envy. So the smaller craft distilleries, why there is an attraction for the bigger companies to purchase them, is because they're established whiskey distilleries. They're already in production. They've already started to make a name for themselves. So it's easier to acquire a brand than it is to start from scratch. Now, these are just some of the distilleries on the craft tour, or that would be considered craft. I'm not suggesting that all of these have been purchased, but those are, of course, ones to watch that would be of very interest and to be acquired. The big game changer, because I don't see acquisitions changing, but the big game changer is how we had to stay nimble during COVID and during the shutdown. Not just changing the way that we create our hospitality measures and hand sanitizing, you know, and keeping our social distance, but the distilleries stepped in to help. The distilleries, instead of making their spirits that they were bottling, they stepped in to help create and make hand sanitizer. So many of the distilleries pivoted on a moment's notice and became crucial to the effort of sanitizer, you know, across the nation. What also changed tremendously in a very short period of time were digital platforms. Digital platforms, for example, e-commerce platforms for selling whiskey. The growth there was over 200% since the shutdown. People literally buying spirits online, which was such a game changer because not all the industry was prepared to do that. Also, digital platforms of what we're doing today. You know, not being able to do our normal whiskey conferences, our normal in-person events, my normal tastings that I do with different guests, you know, at different seminars, were all virtual. So overnight, we had to change the way that we were doing business. Now, how did that affect our growth? Well, we have something called on-premise and off-premise. The on-premise sector is what we call restaurants and bars. The off-premise sector is retailers. For example, Liquor Barn, Westport Whiskey, you know, it's liquor stores. On the liquor store standpoint and retailers, because they never experienced a shutdown truly, you know, during the industry, they could do pickup, you know, locations, et cetera. Retail sales really skyrocketed and was a tremendous value to those retailers. The on-premise sector, of course, with restaurants and bars, because of the true shutdown of those bars and them having to do curbside, you know, reduced capacities affected. So they're trying to stabilize. That did hurt the whiskey industry. I know people generically think, oh, you know, whiskey growth is great, you know, during COVID, during the shutdown. It's not necessarily the case because there's different markets. So where we gained on one side, we might have lost a little bit on the other. Premiumization has helped us tremendously. People paying higher prices for what I spoke of earlier, hard to find products, you know, more advanced products, one-of-a-kind products, new expressions. You know, those offerings also help to stabilize some of the industry changes that we had to face along the way. We're opening slowly, but surely. You know, a lot of the distilleries have taken great precautions on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail to make sure that they're staying responsible, that they're listening to our governor and local authorities to do the best way to protect people. And that's why I included, this is from Buffalo Trace, a little pun wearing the mask, but at the same time, you know, we're not at full capacity, but I am glad to report that even though they may not be at full capacity in offering, they are absolutely at full capacity of people attending. So they are packed. I was at Bardstown Bourbon Company not too long ago, and I was really surprised the number of foot traffic, you know, everybody wearing their mask, everybody using hand sanitizer, 6-foot distancing, you know, during the restaurant experience. But at the same time, people are getting out and about. Spirit sales, as I mentioned, on and off premise, they are starting to climb back, but we are going to have to pay a lot of attention in the future to tariffs. You know, selling globally has been incredibly difficult with tariffs that are being raised, and it's reciprocal. So I think with the new election, we will see what happens after that, no matter who you voted for. And the other thing to keep in mind in the future of whiskey is why we drink. Now, I know that we drink for many moments and many reasons, but what has come in all of the research that I have seen is something that I want to share that you may not realize, but that word share. You know, people like to be together, sharing a cocktail. Just as I started this presentation saying my only regret today is that I couldn't share a cocktail with you, it's our human nature to want to celebrate, to want to be together, to share a drink at a bar. And that human contact has been overwhelming, you know, since COVID, since the shutdown. And I do think that once we're back at 100% capacity, time will tell, but people miss that interaction. You know, people want to be together. And that's where bourbon brings us together. It's been the universal welcome for 30 years across the world. And it is something that we share together and celebrate our culture and heritage. So cheers to Kentucky, all the incredible work that we have done for nearly 200 years when we started making our fine whiskey, and to today for staying nimble and a true industry that affects all of our state, you know, not just Louisville, but our entire state and across our world. So cheers to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy, so very much. You have time for some questions?
I most certainly do. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So Rotarians, rather than using the chat, let's try to individually unmute yourself and ask Peggy your question directly so we can make this more interactive. So Ken, I noticed you had a question in the chat. Could you help open us up?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Thanks so much for this presentation. My question is, I've had some interest in a bourbon new riff, and you know, bourbon aficionados, they always kind of brag about bourbons that are 8 to 12 years old are the best bourbons, and New Riff seems to be doing something a little bit different. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about it and what your thoughts are on the success of young bourbons such as that.
You know, I'm a spirits writer, and I also am a whiskey reviewer for American Whiskey Magazine. So I get to taste about 25 different products every quarter, blind tasting and rating them. New Riff, and this is what circles me back. I did a blind tasting with New Riff. They had a rye called Balboa Rye. And again, craft distillery out of Northern Kentucky. And I rated it over 90. It was that good. It could stand up against any traditional rye or bourbon on the market that we've known for years and years. So that product was probably about 2 years old. And the myth in the industry, frankly, is that older is better. And that's not necessarily the case. It's the art of the master distiller. Now, if I were speaking to a group today that appreciated Scotch, I will say older is better, because Scotch actually uses our used bourbon barrels to make their product. You know, to be a bourbon, and this is why we're such great quality, you can only use a barrel one time to be a bourbon. You know, inside that barrel is charred, it might be toasted, and that liquid sits in the barrel. But first use, we get 85% at least of the flavor. Then we sell it to Scotland, Ireland, Mexico, and they use our secondary barrels. So it's not a matter of how long that whiskey sits in the barrel, 10 years. I've tasted some 10-year-old, 12-year-old whiskey, which is, you know, a little bit of Kentucky slang, long in the tooth, which means it's a little too woody, kind of tastes toothpicky, and that's a turnoff. You know, but I've tasted some 5-year-olds, some 6-year-olds that are absolutely stunning and delicious. So flavor is in the eye of the beholder, but don't be fooled that older is better. Now, I won't negate the fact that there are some 10 and 12-year-olds that I would absolutely have a second glass that I think are outstanding. But don't let that be your only variable to purchase just because it has an age statement.
Peggy, thanks for being here today. We've heard a lot of sustainability initiatives from so many distillers. We've got the new carbon neutral distillery for Bullet down in Lebanon, and
Yes.
lots of trees and all of that. But can you kind of speak to that, what the industry is doing to protect our environment?
Absolutely. You know, let me start with trees. For example, Angel's Envy developed a program of planting trees. You know, when you were buying bottles and got to know Angel's Envy, they were putting money back into the planting of white oak trees. You know, you already mentioned Bullet. That's a huge initiative. Also, water runoff, mash bill. Like, for example, once you actually drain a fermentation vat, or you actually drain a distillery still, there's stillage at the bottom. It's like loose watery corn. And so that is being sold for cattle feed, for example, and really maintained so it's not just like flushed. You know, it's something that's being used. So we are getting more and more creative on that use. I think our warehousing, for example, you know, not every distillery is using, you know, temperature control in a warehouse. So to me, that's sustainable. They're relying on good Mother Nature on our very hot summer days, our very cold winter months, to do it naturally. So, you know, to me, that's an effort. But I think in the future, you're going to see more warehouses that are going to be solar, that I think will be very interesting. So there is a myriad that's happening on that forefront of sustainability. Those are just some examples.
Peggy, this is
Yeah.
Bruce Englehart. I was always taught that the only place bourbon is distilled is in Kentucky, and if it's made in Tennessee or Texas, it's just whiskey. Is that right or wrong?
It is wrong. I'd love to say you were right, but I'm afraid it is wrong. In order to be a bourbon, you can make it anywhere in the United States. Okay, you cannot make a bourbon internationally. So anywhere in the United States, and that's why I was saying, you know, regions like Texas, New York, North Carolina, Atlanta, you know, everyone is starting to have these pop-up distilleries. Some have been in existence over the last 10 years. It's been a tremendous growth. You know, we just happen to make, you know, still 95% of the world's bourbon. So that should tell you something right there, the impact that Kentucky does have and the infrastructure that Kentucky has. It's a very important factor. And I will say too that the Kentucky Distillers Association, to protect our straight Kentucky bourbon, for example, and be able to say you're a Kentucky bourbon, you know, a while back, you know, if somebody from New York, for example, came and purchased Kentucky barrels, took them back to New York, and I'm just using this as an example, took them back to New York, bottled it in New York, and said it was a Kentucky bourbon, you know, they could. However, today's legislation, it has to be produced, barreled, and bottled here in Kentucky to be called a Kentucky bourbon. All right, so there's a little bit of a distinguishing factor, and we're not any different actually than what California has done with champagne and sparkling, you know, the difference between champagne in France and sparkling wine. So that's an example, and that's why we have to protect our equity.
Hey, Peggy, Louis Straub here. How are you?
Well, hello, Louis.
It's good to see
Another
you.
alum.
Yes.
From
Hey,
UK.
Peggy.
Yes.
Yes. The bourbon industry worldwide, as it compares to distilled spirits, how much bourbon is consumed in the distilled spirits industry worldwide? What percentage as compared to vodka, scotch, et cetera? Also as compared to alcohol overall? And how much more room or growth does bourbon have to take over market share from some of the other competing distilled
Okay.
spirits?
Very good question. I don't have exact numbers as far as where bourbon versus scotch or bourbon versus vodka, but what I will tell you is that we're taking a bite out of both of those. That has probably been the biggest growth factors Rye whiskey, according to DISCUS, which is this Distilled Industry Spirits Council that's in charge of all, lobbying, et cetera, for the industry. I believe ryes were up like 19% worldwide. Bourbons, again, had that kind of same growth margin. But what we're seeing is Scotch kind of declining a little bit. Scotch used to eat our britches, honestly, back in, I'd say, the late 1990s. It wasn't until then that bourbon started to change the model, as I spoke to before, about, the retro cocktails and our culture and our rock star master distillers. Scotch did a much better job of marketing globally as a premium product. And so we started to catch on. And now we're starting to take a bite out of Scotch, and we're especially taking a bite out of vodka market share, because vodka is not seen as much as a premium product. They're making cotton candy vodka, and green apple vodka, and all of these different, that really speaks to kind of a very youthful market, where bourbon has established itself as premium. So people are trading up from vodka to bourbon because it is more complex. It is more premium. So I think those have been very, very distinguishing factors. I hope that answers a little bit for you. Now, I think you also asked, where can we go from here? Probably about 4 years ago, the Kentucky Distillers Association created an economic impact study, and it was forecasted for a 20-year trajectory of growth. 20-year trajectory. That's pretty outstanding that they could look that far into it. And I believe it just because, again, I'm fortunate enough to sit on the sidelines. I'm still seeing, even in this market and climate of today, I'm still getting calls from small distilleries that want to invest and start producing whiskey. I am receiving calls all over the United States from entrepreneurs who may have been very successful in technology or a completely different industry and want to play in the bourbon field. So that request and response, knock on wood, for me anyway, I haven't skipped a beat. There's still that demand.
Peggy, this is Mike Richardson. How you doing? Gage says hi. A question, you heard earlier that about Chris Fisher is going to be talking to us soon, and Jefferson Ocean. Could you speak to that? And are there other aging type strategies that are different than the traditional barn, putting the barrels in the barn?
Well, I think that's fascinating question. And I know I talked about expressions, right, earlier, that we've seen a tremendous growth in whiskey expressions. What is a huge trend, and this is what I think you're going to see more of, are finished bourbons. Now, what does that mean exactly? A finished bourbon is a bourbon that has followed all the definition of production to become, quote unquote, a bourbon. But then we'll take that bourbon and we will finish it in a secondary barrel container. It might be a French oak sherry barrel. It may be a Calvados barrel, white oak Calvados barrel. And so they stay in those barrels for maybe 4 months, maybe 6 weeks. It's up to the master distiller, but it creates this incredible finish on the product. So think of Angel's Envy. That is truly, they were in the forefront of, doing finishes for their bourbon. So that is certainly a trend that I wanted to bring to your attention. That is what I'm going to be seeing more and more of, is people being creative with secondary barrel usage. Now, back to your question about Jefferson. I remember when Jefferson came out, I think it was so incredibly bold for them to take that journey of putting barrels, on a ship and letting Mother Nature take its course, with the waves of the ocean. And think of what's happening inside those containers. The whiskey is splashing around. The barrel wood is porous. So it soaks in the wood, out of the wood. That's what gives us our great amber color, because of the char and the vanillin of the toasting that I referred to earlier. So think about all that manipulation of activity. And then think of a pure just barrel warehouse. where you put a barrel into sleep and it has no movement. And it's just sitting there waiting for Mother Nature to let it naturally, go in and out of the wood. That is a heck of a lot of agitation on the ocean, right? So I remember being skeptical. And saying, gosh, I can't imagine that I could really taste what I call the terroir, kind of that influence of the ocean air. And surprisingly and pleasantly surprised, when I tasted it, it really did. I never use a descriptor of salty when I'm referring to a whiskey profile, but there is an ocean saltiness, very slight, not overpowering, very pleasant actually. So it is the real deal. It's very creative, and I think you're going to see, and that's what the craft distilleries, in my opinion, if they've brought nothing else to the ball game, is innovation. They have brought a ton of innovation, and they think differently.
Thank you.
Peggy, Kevin Lynch, great presentation today, by the way. I was curious, you mentioned tariff impact. I was curious how much that might have impacted the past year or so, and also what you see as potential upside growth, particularly Europe, if tariffs are either reduced or eliminated.
Oh my goodness. If the tariffs are eliminated, we'll all be dancing in the streets. And I'm telling you, it will be an explosion because people crave American whiskey. It's not just bourbon, American whiskey. And vice versa, we would like some Irish whiskeys and Scotch and, things like that to come to the US. So the word is if they're gone, it will explode the market in a way we've never seen. However, if it continues down the path that we are continuing, you are not going to see the spectacular growth that we could have in markets like the UK, in markets like Germany, Italy, Japan. It is certainly almost paralyzed that end of the industry, because it's like, what is our threshold that people are willing to pay more of? And we have to keep raising prices. So it's very cost prohibitive.
Hey, Peggy, it's Michelle
Yes,
Oberst.
Michelle,
So good to see
how
you.
are you?
I'm good.
It's like a walk down memory lane for
I'm
me.
sure. I'm sure. Anyway, great presentation. Is there a magic or a brand of an ingredient that you keep at home that you use when you're making your old fashions or your Manhattans that you have on your bar that might help us enhance our bar?
Yes, and my gosh, I have such a laundry list. I don't know where to start. So let me start with some of my ingredients, maybe with my Manhattans and my old fashions. First of all, I always keep sugar cubes. I keep white sugar cubes and brown sugar cubes. And if you've ever had a brown sugar old fashioned, you'll understand why I keep brown sugar cubes. And they're not always easy to find, believe it or not. So Fresh Market, for example, is one that I go to. The cherries that I use, the best I've ever tasted, you'll never go back to a maraschino cherry again, is Luxardo, Luxardo. They are a luxury, let me tell you. They're a bit pricey, but you will never go back to pouring cherry juice from a maraschino jar again because they're outstanding. And I think just like a great chef, better ingredients, like the best olive oils you use, the best balsamic vinegars you use, the better ingredients you use for your cocktail, the better results you're going to have. I also use something called Amaro I always keep it in the refrigerator, and it is a liqueur that I pour a little Amaro into my Manhattan because it makes a black Manhattan, and everybody loves my Manhattan, so I always keep a bottle of that. Michter's Distillery makes a product called Foro, F-O-R-O, Amaro, and I believe Westport Whiskey and Wine, our local retailer. You can purchase it there. Simple syrup. I always keep simple syrup, not just at Derby, although I do have a mint simple syrup, and believe it or not, I keep it in a mason jars because it has such great shelf life to it. So I'll make a mint simple syrup, I'll make a brown sugar simple syrup, a pure cane syrup, and then I've even gotten into flavored syrups where you introduce like orange marmalade as you're boiling your sugar water. So those are my staples for sure.
Well, gives me something to work on. Thank you.
Absolutely. Stock your bar.
Peggy, my name is Rick Harned. Very interested in your presentation. Wondering if you've had any contact with an association of Rotarians internationally that are very interested in improving their knowledge of whiskeys of all kinds. It's called the Whiskey Drinking Rotarians and Members. It was headquartered out
I love it. I will tell you, since we've all gone virtual, and because I'm personally telling you some of my experiences, I've had, for example, one company, it was an IT company that has hired me 15 times to do 15 different virtual bourbon tastings for their clients. So back to your Rotarians, if you want something different, because I think these days we're all zoomed out, right? It can be taxing being on Zoom for quite some time. It has provided, 1 hour bourbon tasting as part of entertainment, as part of enjoyment and incentive. And, some of my clients will send all the ingredients to making, in fact, I'm doing one tonight, I'm doing a cocktail class, and my clients will send all the ingredients to their clients, and they follow along with me virtually as I stand in my kitchen and make cocktails. So would love to speak to, Rotary internationally, if possible. Anybody else that I can assist?
Mac, did you want to ask your question? Mac McClure?
Sure. Are you related to the infamous Booker Noe?
I am, actually. It's funny. My story is very different, though. So you would think well, you'd think I would have grown up, right alongside the still, in the spirits industry, but it wasn't that way at all. Fred Noe, we're cousins, by the way. That's how we're related. But Fred Noe, Booker Noe, et cetera. And I knew Booker. I was lucky as a young woman to meet him. And Fred and I are still, of course, friends, and his young son, Freddie. And so I always tease him and say, hey, you all are the country Noes, and I'm the city Noe. Because I was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. My father, I'm very proud to say, worked 33 years at the Louisville Water Company. And so I did not grow up in the bourbon industry, although we always had the infamous Jim Beam decanters on the bar at Christmas, and there's always Jim Beam in the closet, and so there was always that relationship. But it wasn't until I graduated from the University of Kentucky, and when I graduated from UK, I needed a job just like any college student, and I ended up working in the hotel industry because it was available. And then Brown-Forman Corporation headhunted me a few years into that to come work at their company. Now, granted, this was a competitor of Jim Beam. Well, I didn't know any different just because I needed a job, right? So I went to work for Brown-Forman for 17 years until I left Brown-Forman to start my own company, and that was almost 13 years ago. And 2 weeks into having my own company, I got a call from Jim Beam out of Chicago, because that's their corporate office, and wanted to hire me to create their American Still House. So, oddly enough, here I sit and worked, with a competitor, and then kind of went back to Jim Beam. So all in all, I'm back in the bourbon family in one way or another.
Great, thank you.
Peggy, my name's Kelly Burke. I have a question.
Yes.
When a bourbon states that they are bottled in bond, does that really make a difference in the taste of the bourbon?
Well, it does if you believe in high proof, that the higher the proof, the better the flavor. So bottled in bond was something that was enacted, to ensure quality and to ensure taxes were being paid. So that means that you have to be 100 proof whiskey, okay, 100 proof, and it has to be stored in a certain warehouse from beginning to end, for quality purposes, that it's not removed. So it just depends on how you view the flavor of a proofed whiskey. And it was more of kind of a government requirement at the time, out of quality.
Peggy, you've just done a wonderful job. We appreciate your presentation so very much, and we welcome you back. We look forward to having a glass with you in the future
Yes,
and
can't
being
wait.
together and celebrating all things bourbon. So thank
Right.
you for this enlightening
Thank you for
program.
having me. And, you know, I am proud of our city and I am proud of our state. And I just think brighter days are ahead for all of us, and bourbon can be part of that. So thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. And also want to thank Barbara Collins for the wonderful music that we had today. Barbara, she's chair of our music committee, and that was just outstanding having Jim with us. And Casey, thank you so much for enlightening us about the wonderful work that you're doing with the botanical gardens. It's just extraordinary, and we really are excited about what lies ahead with your organization. For all Rotarians, a reminder to sign up for the November 17th Business Synergy event and to ring the bells. It really is a Rotary Christmas when we get the opportunity to ring the bells for Salvation Army. And next week's meeting will feature Investing in West Louisville Business with Evan Smith, President and CEO of One West, and Amy Schur, President and CEO of El Home. Next week, also join us early for conversation at 11:45. Our pre-meeting host will be Rotarian Marianne Butler, Community Initiatives Manager with LG&E. So thank you everyone for being with us today. This meeting is adjourned.